5 arrested for using city library in Virginia, case puzzles judge, read the Chicago Defender in the summer of 1939. On the morning of August 21st, 5 young African-American men dressed in suits entered the new public library on Queen Street in Alexandria, Virginia. One by one, Otto Lee Tucker, Morris Murray, Edward Gaddis, Clarence Strange, and William Evans asked for a library card application. And one by one, they were denied. Each man then picked a book off the shelf and sat down to read in silence. Head librarian Catherine Scoggin hurried to City Hall, where the city manager called the Alexandria police. When the readers calmly declined to leave the library, officers arrested them on a charge of disorderly conduct. It was the first public library sit-in in U.S. history. A few blocks away, the mastermind behind the protest calculated his next move. For attorney Samuel Tucker, fighting inequality was in his blood. He would remark later, "I got involved in the civil rights movement on June 18, 1913 in Alexandria. I was born black." As Tucker knew all too well, Jim Crow had a tight grip on his hometown. Whites held the power and made the rules. But the situation at the library was especially galling. It had opened in 1937 as a beacon of learning and knowledge, but only for the white community. Tucker and his black neighbors were barred. It was infuriating. And, technically, illegal. Virginia's strict Jim Crow laws required segregation in public spaces. However, the Equal Protection Clause of the U.S. Constitution made it unlawful for African Americans to be barred from public facilities altogether. And so, Tucker had decided to bring the fight for civil rights inside the library. In the spring of 1939, he helped a black neighbor named George Wilson apply for a library card. And when his application was denied, Tucker filed a petition asking the court to force librarian Scoggin's hand. As the court considered the petition, Tucker and his brother Otto recruited young men from Alexandria's black neighborhoods to carry out the sit-in. Inspired by Gandhi, Tucker then spent weeks training the group for nonviolent protest, hoping to ratchet up pressure on the city to integrate. In the fall of '39, Alexandrians and black newspapers across the country followed closely as both the Wilson petition and the sit-in cases worked their way through the courts. Tucker sparred with City Attorney Armistead Booth, who tried to defend the Jim Crow status quo. Meanwhile, Judge James Duncan found the disorderly conduct charge against the quiet sit-in protesters tenuous and delayed his ruling indefinitely. But a resolution of sorts came in January of 1940 via the Wilson case. Judge William Wools denied George Wilson's petition on a technicality, but at the same time struck a blow to the library's whites-only policy. "The city council has not provided a separate library for the colored race," he wrote, and so the court could require the librarian to issue reading cards to Alexandria's black citizens. So was it a victory? Not if Jim Crow could help it. The ruling set off a frenzy of activity as city officials scrambled to avoid actually integrating the library on Queen Street. Within days of Wool's order, the Alexandria City Council resurrected an earlier proposal to build a new black library half a mile away. Less than a quarter the size of its white counterpart, the Robert Robinson Library was constructed in just 3 months and filled with mostly used books. As it neared completion, city officials and even some in the African American press celebrated the separate and unequal library as an incremental victory for Alexandria's black community. But not Samuel Tucker. To him, it was a brick-and-mortar monument to discrimination. As he wrote to Catherine Scoggin about the Robinson branch, "I refuse and will always refuse to accept a card in lieu of a card to be used at the existing library on Queen Street." Despite his frustration, the 1939 library sit-in was historic. It was the first of its kind and introduced public libraries as a new battlefield in the fight for civil rights. Over the next 2 decades, other library integration fights would make headlines in communities across the South. As for Alexandria, its library system quietly started integrating in 1959. However, the disorderly conduct charges against the sit-in participants stayed on the books for another 60 years. An Alexandria court finally dismissed them in 2019, with prejudice. For more Washington area civil rights history, check out our Boundary Stones playlist, and subscribe to WETA PBS on YouTube.